The Broke Girls Society, Reframing Women's Gambling Recovery, featuring Christina Cook. With the expansion of sports betting and prediction markets, the question we often get asked is, what about young men? Christina Cook, founder of the Broke Girls Society podcast, talks about the critical gaps in how gambling harm is recognized, treated, and represented, especially for women. Christina shares her lived experience of problem gambling and the barriers she faced in finding recovery spaces that reflected her reality. The conversation explores why women are often missing from gambling harm narratives, how caregiving roles and stigma create unique access barriers, and why traditional treatment and mutual aid spaces often fail to meet women where they are. Together, we unpack systematic issues in prevention messaging, the lack of gender-responsive treatment options, and the urgent need for lived experience leadership in shaping recovery systems. Christina also highlights the rapid expansion of gambling in Oklahoma, the disconnect between revenue and treatment funding, and the rise of peer-driven recovery communities supporting thousands of women globally. This episode challenges how we think about gambling harm and who we imagine when we talk about recovery.
This is Talking Addiction and Recovery, the podcast talking, you guessed it, all about addiction and recovery. Join your host, licensed professional counselor Andrew J. Schreier, as he and his guests break down recovery topics with raw honesty, delving into niche conversations around the topics of substance abuse, mental health, and gambling. We intend to meet individuals where they are on their own personal journey of recovery, with dignity, respect, and compassion. We'll do more than talk addiction and recovery. We'll explore it. We're glad you've joined us. Here with today's episode, your host, Andrew Schreier.
Christina Cook, an IGRS, is a lived experience advocate dedicated to supporting individuals affected by gambling harm. Drawing from her own recovery journey, she uses her story to help reduce shame, build connection, and remind others that healing is possible. Through her podcast and the safe, empowering spaces she creates for women, Christina offers a platform for storytelling, community, and honest conversations about recovery and resilience. She currently serves on the board of the International Problem Gambling and Gaming Certification Board as Executive Secretary. You can find links to connect and learn more about Christina and the Broke Girls Society in the podcast notes. On this episode of Talking Addiction and Recovery, we want to welcome Christina Cook. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This has been a long time coming, I think.
I know. We're going to talk a little bit about how we know each other and some things I want to share about you that I've known. But before we get started into that, can you give listeners just a little bit of a background about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a person in recovery. I struggled with gambling for about 15 years. I am from Oklahoma, and just a little bit of education around gambling in Oklahoma is gambling wasn't something that I grew up with. We had a couple of racetracks and some bingo halls, but that was generally my only experience with gambling prior to just watching movies where, like Casino and things like that. So I knew kind of the showgirl life and kind of that, but I didn't really have an understanding of gambling. Until about the early 2000s, they passed a bill and allowed gambling on tribal land. And so that was kind of the start of like all these massive casinos going up everywhere. And these are all like Vegas style casinos where we have the machines that have the red spins, of course, the card rooms, things like that. And so, it was probably early 2006, 2007 by the time I stepped into one of the local casinos here. And so, I don't know, 20 some years, we have now just under 150 casinos in our state. And pretty much, and the thing is with these casinos is a lot of them are in rural areas because they're on tribal land. And there's always a joke that I see in the rooms a lot where people ask, hey, pray for me. I have to take 75 into Oklahoma from Texas. And it's because that stretch of highway, it's like exit here for casino, exit here for casino. And so it's like there's so many casinos that you pass driving that. And anybody who's probably listened who's driven that highway from Texas to Oklahoma, it's like, yep, that's very true. It used to be like XXX videos, and now it's been replaced by casino signs. But so, I didn't really have an understanding of like gambling harm, any of that growing up. And even when I was in the throes of my addiction, I didn't understand that what I had was a gambling disorder. And so it kind of took me a long time to figure that out, about 15 years. So a little bit of background. And prior to that, I'd been to Vegas once and I didn't even gamble. I got a tattoo. And so like I'm just as surprised as most people that gambling got me the way that it did.
Yeah, it's amazing. I don't think people know that about Oklahoma. And also you just hear so much about other types of, like sports betting, online betting, mobile apps, prediction markets, and I sometimes think people still forget about brick and mortar casinos that are still being developed. It's not that they're going away. It just seems to have kind of gotten a little bit out of the spotlight as the other ways of gambling have gotten more of like headlines, attention. Because talk about like in that time frame, like what that was like to go through as that was happening. Because it's like a time right now we're going through that with other types of gambling, but you experienced sort of what that was with some emerging things back then.
Yeah, and that's an interesting perspective because I never really looked at it like that. But that's very, very true. And there is a little frustration that there is less talk around brick and mortar casinos, even though they're still just as prevalent and the harm is still just as prevalent. Um, because they're certainly not slowing down. I think, especially in our state, I think there's two new ones. I think technically we have 143, and then there's two really big ones, but we also have one of the biggest ones in the U.S. on the Oklahoma-Texas border. So in states that don't have online gambling or sports betting like Oklahoma, we just strictly have tribal casinos. But we also have one of the highest prevalency rates. 6.3% of our adult population is impacted by gambling in some form. Does that mean they're as impacted as I was? No. But they're feeling impacts, and that's a pretty broad spectrum there. But still, it's still fascinating to me that as the conversation continues on about sports betting and the impacts of those and now the prediction markets, yeah, it just feels like in-person gambling gets further and further behind the mark, even though it's still just as prevalent. Um, but for me, yeah, it's kind of interesting. I really was kind of caught up in that. These casinos went up, it felt like overnight. It started with like these small kind of casinos where it was one room and we were all crammed in there into these big hotel style, Vegas style casinos everywhere. And where I lived and grew up, there were huge casinos within a 30, 45-minute drive of me. Like I could go any direction and hit a casino. But I think that is interesting. Like a lot of states put in their legislation that when they allow gambling in, different forms of gambling in, there's usually some type of help. Not usually, because I think we've seen that most states don't do this. But there are a few states who get ahead of it. I think New York was one, Louisiana is one. Like there's some states that try and get ahead of it. They get the budget in place because they know harm is going to happen, right? And I think Oklahoma, maybe the way that we did it, we certainly didn't do that. And our budget for gambling treatment in Oklahoma is $1 million a year. And you're like, well, $1 million a year, that's fantastic, right? But when you look at the amount of money that gambling is generating, I think in the year 2024, it generated $3.4 billion in casino revenue. And then 170 million of that goes to the state. And then it trickles down that we get 750 of that particular gambling revenue, and we get another 250 from the lottery. So when you look at the impact, but then you look at the prevalency rate, like we certainly didn't create room for it. And so now it feels like we're certainly behind the curve and we're still kind of struggling to make sure that there are less barriers for help. But as far as me personally, yeah, I definitely got caught up in that thing of like all of this is happening and I'm just kind of caught up with it, and it wasn't until I started to experience harm to realize there was no support system in place. There was no structure to get ahead of it. There was no education around it. And I think that that's what kept me in the circle for as long as I did, because they certainly weren't having conversations around gambling. We had the DARE program. They would come in, talk about drugs and alcohol, but nobody was ever talking about gambling.
Yeah, we still struggle with that today, which is still, I mean, we're making some progress with it. I see more places doing it, but it's still nowhere near, like if you want to talk to a younger audience of substance use or mental health or even online stuff, but like gaming or maybe online pornography, like there'd be, yeah, we need to talk about this. Yeah, we need this. Then it's gambling. It's like, well, what gambling? And also there's a another population with gambling harm that often gets missed too, which you do a lot of work with, which is with women in gambling. And we're going to talk about that as well. But I want to revisit something real quick. So for audience members that don't know that you and I know each other, we just saw each other earlier this month at a conference. We got to see each other at the month before at a conference. And I want to tell you this because I don't think I've ever told you this, but when I got into gambling, I got into it because of the Wisconsin Council on Problem Gambling. That's where I live and do my work. And you kind of start with knowing the people that are kind of in your that circle, right? Because now you're meeting people who do that work, and there's not a lot of them out there. So it was sort of like a very small group. I will say, looking back, you were one of the first people that I heard of doing work with gambling, like outside of my state. And I heard about you and this person also, aka the Broke Girls Society. And all of a sudden, like you were one of the first people that I started seeing doing work that was just beyond what I was seeing in my state. And to also know where that is today, because you and I know a lot of people who, David Yeager works with military, Saul works with youth, we've got Adam Lyons and the Modern Meaning podcast. Like there's a lot of great names of people who are doing some specific work with gambling. And your name is the one that comes up with women in gambling more than anyone. And so, one, I wanted to just share that with you because I don't think I ever shared that with you that you were like one of the first people who I started to learn about their work outside of Wisconsin and the impact that it had because it showed me that other people were focused on this, doing this, and were making this a big part of like their mission and what they wanted to do. And also to see now also where you are today and everything going on. So I want to share that with you, give you some flowers.
Well, thank you.
The thing that comes up a lot though is I've gotten media requests. I've gotten some talks in presentations asking about, young men in gambling is the concern. And oftentimes I'm not hearing anyone asking, well, what about women in gambling or what about even young women? I know you do a lot of work with this, so I want to give you a pretty wide net here to cast as much as you want to talk about women in gambling, but also where are we today with it? Because it seems like we're still missing that even after everything we've gone through with gambling.
Okay, you ready? Here
Yeah,
we
I
go.
am.
You're opening it up for me.
I am.
So I do want to start off by saying that any conversation around gambling harm is important because going down this road, it might sound like I'm saying it isn't. So I just want to say this, so just for the clarity of the record, as long as you don't edit this out, that any conversation around gambling harm is very, very important. It's very meaningful. But I also get a lot of the media requests who come through me because, like you said, the names you mentioned, plus there's a handful out others out there who are really vocal in the space, and we're trying to get into the media and raise awareness, and whether it's through a podcast, whether it's through our advocacy work. So there's so many of us out there doing a lot of that work, and it's certainly not easy work. Um, but there's not enough of us out there. So I think when people are just trying to find somebody who wants to talk about gambling, they just kind of Google and whoever pops up, they send these media things to, and I get so many of them. I mean, from some of the huge news networks that I would be more than honored to be part of. Because I've certainly been part of a few that I shouldn't have been honored to do. But and it always comes at me through this male lens of young men and gambling, which again is a very important topic. It's very, very impactful that young men are getting knocked off course so young with the gambling and but there's so much conversation about that. There's so many stories. And I think when it comes, and this was told to me by a couple of different journalists who work in the space, I'm like, why can't you expand this to be women and or any of these? And they're like, well, conversation around sports betting is so big that we need to kind of stay in that lane, right? They can't come out of that lane because they may not get published. And because the sexy conversation right now is the sports betting, which we're seeing a transition into the prediction markets, right? And that kind of conversation. Well, I think that that's going to be harder to find, like people talking about it in the narrative and things like that. So oftentimes when they reach out to me, I'm like, hey, women are experiencing harm around their gambling just as much as these young men. And I even had several wanting to talk to girlfriends or wives of young sports bettors. And that's why they were reaching out to me because they were wanting to know if I could do that. And I'm like, well, sure. I talk to women who are affected others all the time. And there needs to be conversations so that women know how to protect themselves. They know how to seek treatment for themselves if they find themselves in a relationship where harm is happening. Because we know that domestic violence rates are up for the partners of gamblers, right? And things like that. So they're, especially when we're looking at younger men and sororities and things like that, like that's a whole nother conversation, right? But when we focus on just talking about young men and gambling, and then we talk about women who are partners of these young men gambling, like then it just really narrows the lens of like who's affected by gambling, right? Well, these young girls who are boyfriend or girlfriends of their boyfriend gambling, like then the whole world just gets this view that women themselves aren't experiencing harm through the action themselves. They're experiencing harm as affected others, which is again an important conversation. But you're leaving out the huge demographic of people who are experiencing harm. And there's just something about the conversation about women in gambling. There's still so much shame, still so much stigma. There's not a lot of voices sharing their experiences when it comes to this because of the continued shame and stigma around their gambling, that more conversations could really help us do a lot of work in breaking that shame and stigma. But it's just not the sexy conversation. And that's the part that I really, really struggle with because these media outlets who are just doing their job, they're reporting the news, right? They're trying to stay in a lane that people are reading about. And when you ask them to step outside of that lane, they're like, why? Like, they don't have any skin in the game. They don't, as a gambling term, right? They don't,
Yeah.
there's nothing for them to step outside of these normal lanes that have been woven with men and gambling. And again, any conversation around gambling, anybody affected, these are all very, very important. I'm seeing a lot around parents of gamblers, but what's really interesting is I'm seeing a lot more children of gamblers speak up. And again, all of these conversations, I don't know how many times I can say this to make sure everybody understands. These are all very important conversations, but my passion, because my own experience, right? I was the one struggling with gambling. I would sit in a casino and I would be surrounded by hundreds of women who were just as zombied as I was at that slot machine. So I know, and just through my own work over the last 5 years, this is a huge issue with women. We're starting to see that, a lot of times what I heard early on was like women aren't as prevalent in the helplines. That's because women, and yes, I'm speaking for all women, we ain't got time for that. We don't have time to take care of ourselves. We don't have time to call a helpline. We don't have time to not be well. And so, of course, you're not going to see women reaching out for help on a helpline. You're going to see them at home trying to work on their finances, make a budget, because maybe that's the problem. You're going to see them, struggling with their relationships because maybe that's the problem. It's never going to be the gambling because the gambling is the thing that they feel is keeping them sane. I can only speak from my own perspective, but that's very much was my situation of like, who would understand this? And I I'm causing all these issues. I need to fix it.
It reminds me a lot of I had a client that was seeing me several years ago. This was probably like over a decade ago. For it was it was a male. The husband was seeing me for because of the wife's alcohol use. And I remember he got to a point where he wanted to go to a meeting, and the in their community there was a meeting that had an AA meeting, and there was right and next to it was also a meeting for spouses and loved ones, an Al-Anon meeting. So him and his wife actually decided to go, and they would both go at the same time, go into their different meetings, right? And I remember him telling me he walked into the Al-Anon meeting, and it was all women in there, and he was the only guy walked in. And the first thing they said to him was, "Oh, the room you're looking for is the one over here." And he was like, "No, I'm my wife struggling with alcohol, and I'm coming here." And then I think about that, and I relate it to gambling continues to try to find a seat at the table among all these other things, right? Substance use, mental health, and everything else that's going on. Even trying to get a phone number put onto something is a challenge. And then I'm hearing you talk about it's like now women in gambling's trying to fight for a seat at the table among gambling. And gambling knows more than anything else how hard that is. So it's not asking for someone else to not have a seat at the table or to take them away. But gambling knows more than most issues that we deal with in this profession, what it's like to not have a seat at the table. And and then here we are. And I was worried about women in gambling. And I'm curious where you are with this. I started being more concerned when daily fantasy sports became a thing, and with increase in video games, because we were starting to see more women engaged in fantasy sports that weren't necessarily really into sports much before that, but now this is becoming like a popular thing. You can do this with friends, make teams, do all that. And then also with video games, women were closing the gap with men in playing. So to me, I was like, that was years ago when I was starting to see those things, and I'm like, why wouldn't gambling follow that? Like, as far as I know, they're trying to reach as many audience members as they can, or in people that gamble. They're not saying, well, women, let's not worry about that. So to me, I was like, how is that then? We see the trend growing with that, the concern with it, but then all of a sudden, once again, gambling just seems like that's not where, even harmed by gambling is where someone doesn't belong. And I'm like, that's not how it works. Like, that's not how it's
Absolutely
not
not
how
how
it
it
plays
works.
out.
Like, and and you make a bunch of really good points, right? Like several of them. And just to kind of go back to where you were talking about the man that walked into a room full of women. When we're women are often they're less likely to help themselves, but they will be first in line to help somebody else, right? So if their partner is going through something, women are the ones that take to the internet, like, or their children going through it, right? I can't tell you how many parents reach out for support before the actual child reaches out for support, or they're dragged along by their parent. I'm
Yeah.
sure you've seen that
Yep.
plenty of times in your own practice.
And spouses.
Um,
And spouses. Like
and
that happens
spouses,
too.
right? And it's usually the woman dragging them in, right? You get help. They're going to help you. But I bet you that woman might be less likely to seek help for herself. And that's just kind of the societal world that women have been built up in, right? Of like, you need to keep everything and everyone together, keep that facade going no matter what. Um, I don't know, you can think about it when you're dead, kind of thing. Like, it's a very different kind of perspective when we're looking at like men, for instance. And again, this is a generalization. It's mostly going to be true. Like with men, they typically, when we're looking at the societal lens of gambling for those impacted, like men are usually looked at it as kind of a provider role, whereas women are often looked at as a caregiver role, right? So when men have experienced trouble with gambling, like it's like, oh, you're a bad provider, risk taker, kind of through that provider role, not so much as a caregiving. right? Oh, what about your family? All those things. But when a woman experiences gambling harm and starts to talk about it, they're like, well, how could you? You're a mother. Like, how could you do that? But I'm not saying that's going to be every conversation, but a majority of them can often say. And when you're looking at recovery spaces, like men oftentimes fill the room of like gamblers, uh, anonymous meetings, and things like that. And you don't see as many women. Well, nobody ever stopped to think, well, why aren't women in here? Well, do they have caregivers? Do they have somebody to take care of the kids? Do they have like the resources to be able to come and spend an hour and a half in a meeting? Oftentimes the answer is going to be no. Whereas a man oftentimes has somebody to caregive at home because that's general role, right, of the opposite sex. So there's all these little kind of factors that make a difference. Factors that make kind of a difference in how we show up for ourselves and how we show up for supports and things like that. So I just wanted to address that. Like, yeah, he was probably because women are typical, like they want to get involved in somebody else's care. But again, we often put ourselves on the back burner to do that. Um, but what I'm seeing kind of when we're looking, there are so many differences with women who struggle with gambling versus men. You hear the term addiction is addiction is addiction, right? It's a really common term throughout. I think there's a lot of addiction counselors who believe that as well. But we know that that's not true,
I
right?
don't.
Yeah, there's
I
been,
don't. But
you don't. But hey, this might be a good kind of conversation around it,
yeah,
right? So, because I had a really great conversation with Elizabeth Thielen, who's out at Illinois, and she's amazing. And we both really agreed on this is like addiction is addiction is addiction. There's a lot of common things, right? A lot of commonalities around that. There's a lot of behavioral, a lot of oftentimes to me, like addiction. And again, I am not a professional. I am a peer. This is my own experience. Um, oftentimes addiction or any type of kind of compulsive disorder is usually an internal, like a symptom of an internal thing. And for me, that's exactly what it was. Like I had avoidance issues, I had abandonment issues, I had a lot of issues from childhood that I just curated and carried around. And so, but when it came to kind of treating the disorder of gambling, it looks a little different, right? Because I'm not ingesting anything. It's not a chemical thing that's making me do this or have these behaviors. And so sometimes somebody who generally treats addiction but doesn't have any understanding of gambling, they're not kind of putting that together of like, I'm pushing a button that's giving me a high. You know what I mean? It's changed the whole way my brain is wired and thinks. I'm not drinking, I'm not ingesting. It's just kind of there's a difference there. That's a key difference between, the disorder itself. Um, but when we're looking even further into that of like, and I guess, when we're looking at kind of the differences even in like between women and gambling and men and gambling, like there are so many differences in how you treat it and how you navigate it and the conversations that you have. For instance, if a woman has experienced harm in a relationship at the hands of a man, to say that the only place she can recover is in a room full of men, would you recommend as a clinical professional to say, hey, you need to go to this Gamblers Anonymous that I know is mostly men, because they're going to understand you. And you're like, and this woman's like, okay, but I've experienced trauma. Like, is this going to be a good fit for me? Right. And those types of conversations. So when we're looking at differences, whether it's addiction differences or disorder differences or male, female, there's always going to be this kind of what is going to work? What is best for the person? And where are they going to find the support that they need? Where are they going to find the understanding? And kind of back to, and I'll close it off with this, kind of back to that addiction is addiction is addiction. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who are just totally turned off on therapy because they went to therapy and the addictions therapist didn't have any understanding of gambling. And they would talk to them about, their grandmother's bingo habits or what they used to do in college. They would have no understanding of the impacts of gambling harm or even how to how to really talk about it without this kind of invalidating comparison. So that's kind of what I meant by this like blanket. Like you really do have to have an understanding of each of the addictions and disorders.
Yeah, I was an early person. It wasn't really until getting into gambling. I went for a CEU, like an 8 hour thing, and I've been in the profession for like 10 years, and I was like, I kind of wanted to learn something different. The Wisconsin Council had like a 1 day, 8 hours, pretty low cost to learn about gambling, and like right away from the get-go I was realizing that it is so different. You go to a gambling conference and you realize that part of the ways of addressing it, talking about it, treating it is a lot different than if you would have gone to another conference. So that's why I really wish that's where we try to bring people from those different areas to witness that. I brought it up when we were in Ohio, and I was doing my talk on uh, breaking the silence on money. One of the things that I was talking about is when you go to a gambling conference, you tend to see resources and support for finances, financial counseling and financial recovery. I said you can go to a conference and there could be maybe a small number of exhibit tables, but you may find one or two that are about financial recovery. I said you could go to a substance use or mental health conference with hundreds of exhibitors, and there is nothing in there about financial recovery. And that's where I wish, some people from the substance use mental health would go to a gambling conference to see like how different it is, that it's not just, oh yeah, this is what I do with, like, there's some things that are similar, but there's just a lot more different things that to me, what's helped me to work in my other areas has become doing gambling counseling work. Now I talk a lot more to everyone I work with about finances and about money, because you can't not talk about money when it comes to the gambling work. So it's yeah, I can see why some people get caught into that. Like, there's so many similarities, and sometimes you mentioned rural areas with casinos, and I also have to remember sometimes there's like one counselor in the rural area that's trying to address everything that's
Oh,
going on out there. So like sometimes like that's what it is, but we should try to help that person get more education and awareness on things like these topics. So
absolutely.
I want to the Broke Girl Society. I say that's also what you're known as, aka the Broke Girl Society. Can you tell listeners a little bit about that, because that is also what you referred to. People even may say the Broke Girl Society. I can't think of her name, but they at least know that. So that has become very connected with you. Can you share a little bit about the what that is and everything that sort of went into how that came to be?
Yeah, so when I first entered recovery, I was still kind of figuring everything out. But what I noticed too, and again, I didn't work with a gambling, somebody who was certified in gambling disorder. I just went to an addictions counselor, and she had no understanding of gambling. She told me that from the beginning. But she was in recovery herself, and she said I can be helpful. She was in recovery for something else, but she said I can be maybe helpful on that side of things, and like we can just talk. And she was helpful for me, because I had a lot going on, and she helped me untangle in a lot of ways. But I found peer support through one of my best friends. You know her as well, Tara. And she really, really helped me on that side of it. But when I first came into the space before I knew anybody, I was just trying to find women talking about it. I found podcasts. I found Brian Hatches, who was one of the first people to do a podcast about gambling recovery. I devoured his podcast, Jamie's podcast After Gambling. But all of them had a continuous theme of like there were no women represented on their podcast. And then I came across this little 6 episode series on Hatch's podcast, and it was Gambling Got the Girls. And there were 2 girls, Tiffany and Danielle. And I loved hearing them talk about it. They were so open, and Tiffany's no longer with us, but I get to see Danielle quite a bit through community groups and things like that. But it just really kind of made me feel better. Like these women had not that they experienced harm. That never sounds good, right? When you're like, it made me feel better to hear these women talk about their horrible stories. But that was the truth of it. It did. It made me feel better knowing that women were out there experiencing harm, that I wasn't alone, right? Because my GA meetings were roomfuls of men. There would be a woman every once in a while come in and they never came back. And so that was kind of the first real female connection I'd heard. And then I had gotten myself into some groups and made connections that way. And then Tara reached out to me because I had started posting on Instagram like 60 days. My ninth paycheck, I didn't spend gambling, things like that, because I was like looking for some type of connection between other women. And she reached out to me and had me on her podcast. I absolutely love it. The Ambitious Addicts, Beyond the 12 Steps. Shout out, Tara. And it just, that connection, I think, really started something for me. She was just as empowered by helping women. Her story has gambling, of course, in it. And I just thought I loved the whole podcasting thing, but her podcast wasn't gambling specific. And I wanted to be gambling specific. So 4 months into my recovery, I released the first episode of the Broke Girl Society. It was just me being nervous in the middle of a thunderstorm talking about gambling. And here we are. We're this July we'll celebrate 5 years of doing it. And we're, 150 episodes in. At first I struggled to find women who would share their stories. And now I have a queue, and like it's something that I've been able to help women feel more comfortable about sharing their story in the way that I do the podcast and the way that I do the interviews. There's no video. It's all, they can be as anonymous as they feel comfortable to be. But those conversations, I think, have really, really changed how we navigate this space with women. In particular, we talk about mom guilt. We talk about relationships. We talk about dating in recovery. We talk about things that need to be talked about and that often there's not space for in rooms of recovery, especially if they're mixed rooms of recovery, right? I can't imagine talking about hormones in a room full of 70-year-old men. Like they're going to be like, that's not appropriate. We don't want to hear that. But it's a very real part of women navigating recovery. I'm 47. Hormones are kicking my ass. And it's making me feel a little bit like I did in those early days of recovery, those later days of addiction, like just crazy. It's the only way I can explain it. I'm sure somebody listening would be like, yeah, I get it. I get it. And so it just made me really think about kind of the numbers we see women coming into recovery, kind of the ages that we see. And oftentimes they're middle-aged women. And it's like, oh, got it. Perimenopause. Are we talking about that? No. So, that's kind of what started the Broke Girl Society. And how I named it was I went through my journals and I kept seeing the word broke. I was broke financially, which was the play, right? I was broke financially, but I was broke spiritually, physically, mentally. My health had really taken a dive because I didn't take care of myself and I'm diabetic. So like broke just came up for me in so many ways. I was like the Broke Girl Society. And yeah, everything is me behind the scenes, but it's very much a community of women who care about each other.
I want to ask you something and I just want to, I was very curious when you shared your story about how early in your recovery that you started the podcast. Because in my mind, I'm hearing some very maybe old school ways of that's too early. You should wait a year until you make a major change. To me, I'm like, that's awesome that you did that because I imagine that was something that was good for you. It did so many things, even not knowing where it was going to lead to. Like in that moment, like it was something that was you felt passionate about, you were driven. It was something that like you were giving you this purpose. But I also can just hear those whispers from some people who are thinking like that's too early or you should wait Did any of that come into your mind, or was that things that anyone told you, or was it just something that is, to me, I'm just bringing up stuff that's from what some people still stick to as far as like the formula for how this works, which like doesn't really exist, as you can tell that I don't believe that, but I just know some people are kind of told, I guess overall, some people are told to pump the brakes on things early in recovery because it's seen as risky, that you're going to take on too much, you're going to go full steam ahead and not be able to. So there's a lot of messaging around early in recovery, and it's not just avoiding high risk things, but it's also, not taking on new things, making major decisions. I always say life doesn't really work that way. Like you can't just say I'm not going to make a major decision in the next year, because life's going to throw major decisions at you when you have no idea that's going to happen. So I'm very curious, where are you with that? All that stuff I threw out there about how early it was. I'm applauding it, but also I know some people may have had second guesses.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's people out there still second guessing me. Like if they're just like, I wonder if she's too early in recovery to be doing this. 5 years later.
Yeah.
But it's still like there's always gonna be those people, right? And there's always gonna be those people, like typically older clinicians, that are very set in kind of the way things have always been done. And and yeah, they weren't whispers to me. They were flat out, like, especially my therapist at the time. Like, I wanted to divorce my partner at the time, or my husband at the time. And she kept saying, nah, you really need to wait a year. And I'm like, here's the thing. He's not supporting me. He does. When I told him about my gambling, and this was 2 months of me working on myself, working with a therapist, he was like, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. You're just bad with money. I knew right then, like he wasn't going to get it. And the further I moved into my recovery in that year, he became more insecure. He fought with me over everything. He would make it impossible for me to record a podcast while he was home because he would go into the kitchen and he'd slam all the pans and slam all the doors. And he would start a fight with me right before a meeting because I'd be like, I've got a meeting at 7 o'clock that I need to do for recovery. And then he would get in a fight with me so that so I'd miss a meeting. And I just realized this pattern that was happening with me. Like he was not supportive of me. Like I think the more I was working on myself, the more it made him look at himself. And he just wasn't ready to address it. And so anyway, but I just kept being reinforced with it, like, you need to wait a year, you need to wait. But I guarantee you, before that year was up, I had my apartment picked out, I had the papers ready, and come up on that year, but I could have left 6 months prior to that and still had the same path. You know what I mean? Like, but I kept listening to that. And I think there are going to be situations where that is helpful, right? Especially if your mental health is in a really hard place. Like, you gotta work to be able, and I'm sure there's reasons for all of that. But for me, I've always just looked at my recovery as an individual choice in everything that I do. And though GA was a huge part of my recovery early on, I outgrew it within about a year. And that was the marker for me. Like, yeah, it's a great program, great structure, and it's saved thousands and thousands of lives. But at some point, I outgrew just reading the yellow book for 45 minutes and kind of the superficial shares. Like, again, it could have been my own meetings, right? There are some amazing GA meetings out there. So this isn't to be derogatory towards GA. It's just my own journey, right? And so yeah, in everything I tried to do, I would get some resistance of like, oh, well, you're just barely a year. Okay. Oh, well, you're just 2 years. Okay. Well, what's the mile marker here? Like, somebody even told me, a really good friend of mine, she said, well, when you're about 3 years, they'll start to take you seriously. And even I'm going to throw Dr. Wiley Harwell under the bus here, just because I think he'd appreciate it. But I reached out to him really early on. And for those who don't know, he's the head of the Oklahoma Association for Problem Gambling and Gaming in our state. And I reached out to him really early on. I said, how many of you can help? Like, I knew from the moment I entered recovery that something had changed in me. Like, I was never the person I avoided book report day at all costs because I didn't want to the point where I almost failed English, like because I hated speaking in front of people. And here I was like, what do you need me to do? So something really changed for me. And I think it gave me the purpose and the passion that I needed for my own recovery to help others. And I think that that's okay as long as you're working on yourselves too. Like there's nothing that says you can't help others while you're helping yourself. You know what I mean? Because those interactions help me just as much as they help them. But I think I've always been the type of person to kind of always lean on the side of caution. And so I've always really thought about my next moves. I've always really thought about my conversations and so I don't know if that's just something that's always been ingrained in me, but back to Wiley, he was like, nope, I don't usually use lived experience. You know, there's too many variables. They always end up going back out. And I just said to him in that moment, I said, whether I go back out or not to gambling has nothing to do with you. It has to do with my own recovery and my own work in recovery. And so I have never allowed anybody to put that on themselves if they ask me to come and talk. Like my recovery has nothing to do with anybody else but me. I am the only one accountable for my recovery. So if I go back out to gambling or anything else that's harmful to me, that's all on me. And I get to decide what's too much and what isn't enough. And though I've had some trials and errors with this over the last 5 years, because last year was brutal for me, that now I'm kind of having anxiety attacks before I present. And so this is something I'm working on with therapy because my own self-awareness says, Christina, you need to talk about this. We need to figure this out. Um, I think it's just, and I do work for Wiley now, but it took me 5 years to do it because he was so resistant. But I think he kept hearing my name on every corner. And I remember specifically being in a meeting with him and somebody was like, how is she not working for you? Like, she's one of the most well-known people working in this space and you don't use her? And he was just like, yeah, and then a few months later, I'm working for him. So we're trying to work on a peer program here in Oklahoma. And I'm able to help out in that way. But, yeah, it's something that I've challenged since I entered recovery. I've just kept, what I do is I challenge it by example. Like if I go back to gambling, I'll be the first person to tell the world. It's all on me. It's not on anybody else. It's not on the work that I do. It's, if I go back to gambling, it's because I let the boundaries become porous. I stopped working on myself and I just opened the door for it. And my main goal in life, and I know that I have to stay true to my own recovery and my own, not even recovery anymore for me. I'm 5 years in. It's self-growth, self-awareness. It's just life for me now. And I have to use all of those tools that I've learned over 5 years to keep myself safe so that I can do this work for everybody else.
I think that's great to share because I know for me, I think back to when I started this profession like 20 years ago, and I think where it used to be was we think we could identify what is risk for everybody, right? And then we try to prevent that risk from causing further harm or, having someone use again, gamble, substances, whatnot. I just remember like it was so ridiculous the things that we used to put down as like this music is risky to you, the places you go is risky to you, these movies are risky to you. It's like almost like everything became a risk when for some person it's like that means nothing to them. We had St. Patrick's Day was last couple days ago, right? And there was a big recovery event in our community that was at a NBA sporting event. It was a recovery night at a NBA game, right? But I know there was some thoughts on, well, it's on St. Patrick's Day. Can we do that? Is that too? And I think back in the day, it used to be like, well, no way, you can't go out on St. Patrick's Day. Anyone in recovery needs to like stay at home, lock up, or be in a meeting or be in treatment. Like they can't be out on St. Patrick's Day because there's drinking on St. Patrick's Day. Then of course you have the people who are like, I drank whatever day it was, didn't matter what it was, or I gambled on whatever day it was. It didn't matter if it was a holiday or not. And what I love hearing about you is talking about how like we have to get away from just believing that we know what is risk for everyone. And that's where I really like talking with people more now. I use the words I dive into more of crisis talk with people about like, hey, when are things getting to be like out of hand? Or when at one point does it seem like things are getting to be like really close calls? Because I just want to understand more like what they see as risk, what they see as, getting closer to that. So I see this shift happening where we no longer say, "Hey, I haven't met you yet, but I hear you have a problem with gambling. I know what all the risks are. It's these places, it's these people, it's these things," versus being able to say to this person, and that's where to me that means for someone doing this early in the recovery could mean no, this isn't good for them because they are aware of that. They know what is risk to them, which might mean I'm going to hold off on this for now. This isn't something I'm going to jump into. For someone else, where it's this, I don't see the risk in this. There's other things that I see as a risk to my recovery. Then why can't they then do that? So I'm really glad to hear, and thanks for sharing that because I know that's part of your journey, your story, and how early it was in your recovery. But I found that so fascinating that you did that because I could imagine, and as you shared, some of the people that discouraged it or said it wouldn't have been a good idea, and sometimes people will fall into that because they are not trying to act like they're not taking their recovery seriously, or they're not trying to sound like they're not following a program. Like some people have been held back for doing some things that could have been really, really good for them because they're not trying to ruffle any feathers early in their recovery, which I think there's just it's not needed. So thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I think too, it's like it becomes this partnership, right? I think oftentimes when people come into recovery, they're giving so much information about what's going on with them before there's even a connection really made, right? So it's like aside from like the Google searches of like how do I get help and those types of things, oftentimes when they meet somebody that could be really helpful, they're just given this list of do's and don'ts, and this is what you should do. Even walking into a 12-step meeting, oftentimes they're given packets of information and like all of this, what you should and shouldn't do, and those kind of conversations are happen, and they're all really important. But it's like you got to build that connection first, right? So that they understand where you're coming from. You have a little better understanding of where they're coming from, which is why I'm a huge advocate for therapy and um, peer, if those are options are available to you on top of 12 step and everything, like really round out what support looks like for you and start building these connections and relationships. And so that way it becomes this, you're really treating the person as much as the disorder, right? You're really kind of having this conversation like, all these risks that are just standardized risks, right? But this person may not be, in the realm of some of these risks.
Any
And
of
so it
them.
becomes any of them at all, right? They could just be like, there's so many different things. And until you get to know the person, how can you really determine the risk? And and I think oftentimes people just lead with what they know versus what they know about the person. And so, and I see that in the rooms a lot
It's
too.
a great
Like
statement. That's a great statement. Leading with what they know versus you what they
what
know
they know about the
someone who
person,
yeah,
right?
that's a great statement.
Which is like, that's why lived experience stories and voices are so important because that's what everything else is built off of, right? The textbooks that people read and research and all of that is all built off of lived experience. But it's cumulative. I cannot say my words. Um, we're all these different experiences, but that doesn't mean that everybody's going to experience every little thing, right? You can take the BGS, for example, and you can read inside the group and all their kind of different experiences, but very similar experiences. And so even in the Broke Girl Society, we lead by kindness first and foremost, compassion, empathy, all of those things. But we lead specifically by just share what helped you. Don't pretend you know this person who posted 3 sentences about what's going on with them. And then you're like, well, you need to do this. You need to do that. All this person needs to know is that she's going to be supportive and that you know, there's going to be support for her and that she can kind of build what she needs to do by your experiences and by what helped you. And so I think that that's how I've been different in the space. And I have been called like some of the worst names in the world for the way that I present my own recovery because I lead by curiosity and kindness and empathy and understanding that I don't know everybody's story. And so I can't assume that what worked for me is going to work for them. And that has always been my philosophy. It will continue to be my philosophy. But I had somebody tell me that I was risking people's lives by sharing our stories on podcasts. Like, and it's kind of like I always say, like, and I'm going to call them hardcore GAers, and I don't mean this in any offensive way, even though somebody's going to be offended. Um, it just means that it helped them. It saved their life, and so they think that it's going to help everybody in the same way. But the generations coming up now, they don't look at things the same way. They don't think of things the same way. What they're experiencing with the online gambling and prediction markets and sports betting are not experiences that somebody who gambled at the racetracks in 1956 is going to relate to. So it's like there's so many differences in how we're all coming into recovery, how we need help, where we need support, and who we are individually. To say that one thing is a one size fits all, to me, that's where the harm is, right? Because there's so many people falling outside of that box that aren't getting support. And because it doesn't fit in somebody else's idea of what recovery looks like. And so that's where the work really needs to happen, right? The expansion of how do we support people, everybody else's views. Hard truths belong to the people who are invested in us. They belong to our therapists and sponsors, people who know us, right? It's not just hard truths when we don't know who the person is or what they're experiencing. And so, yeah, I truly, truly believe that is maybe lead less with information and more with connection.
Yeah, I remember there's two things that stand out about that is I always try to say I'm not the expert in the room when I'm in a counseling session with someone. They might think I am because, I've got the credentials and I'm the person that's giving this service, but I believe they are the expert of themselves. Like
Yeah.
they know more. And the other thing that I used to do this, which I'm now grateful that I don't, but I remember as I was doing this work for so long, people would sometimes begin to tell me their story. And sometimes someone would say something like, "Oh, I'm sure you've heard this before because you do this." Like I've heard that because like people knew I worked with like substance use and gambling, so it's not that uncommon for someone to when I meet them for the first time, suddenly they go, "I'm sure you've heard this before. I'm sure you've heard this plenty of times." And I used to say in my not so wise days, I used to say things like, "Yeah, I hear stories like this. I've done this for a while, or this is what I do like all day. So this is what I do." Thinking what I was trying to do was try to show them that I had some experience in what they were presenting me with. I was trying to connect that way. But to me, what that did though was in my mind started to get me to just be like, okay, this is someone else, like this is another person who's got substance use issues or gambling. So okay, now it's like I'm trying to think like I know them when I'm just meeting them for the first time. So after I kind of had that moment of realization, what I started telling people now is when someone says to me, "Hey, I'm sure you've heard this before. You've done this for a while." I go, I've actually, I say, I've never heard your story. I've never heard yours, and if you want to share it with me, I would love to hear it because I do think that sometimes people think someone walks into a room and they see the diagnosis or the problem, and they think because they know what that is that now I know what I can do for this person, when really uh, there's so much you don't know about this person. Like, okay, if you know about that, spend time then learning about them. Like, find out more about them versus, and if you don't have to focus too much on what you do know, that's where like the be curious part of it and non-judgmental and that safe space is so important because that's the information you do not. Those are things that don't go on forms and intakes about
Yeah.
simple questions. Those are things that are only going to come about when there is a connection, where there is, safety and, a willingness to share those things that just don't, you know, aren't shared on a checkbox. So I I'm really grateful for that because I used to say things like that. I used to be the person that was like, I've heard these stories
You've heard
before.
one story, you've heard
I
them
get
all,
it.
like they're all the
Yeah,
same. It's always kind of frustrating to me if you have any clinicians listening, like when you're doing like a presentation and you're sharing your story, like for anybody, any lived experience sharing their story, it's like reopening the wounds, right? Every time I share my story, my story is hard. My story didn't take me to jail. I mean, it very easily could have. But, my story, gambling got me through a lot of really hard things in life. Cancer battle, infertility, relationships, abuse, very, very hard mental abuse and or narcissistic abuse. And so it's like for me to go there and to rehash these wounds of like everything I went through to share my story or anybody else, whatever they're sharing their story and to see like being in a room and somebody like they've already heard it, or they're like, oh, I hear dozens of these stories all the time. This is my clients tell me all the time, right? But then to see them on their phone or their computer during a session and you're just like so vulnerable and so like you're ripping off all these scabs to do this work. And that's really hard when you get met with that. Like, what's lived experience? Like, we listen to lived experience all day long. Why do I want to listen to it in a conference or something like that? Like, that's some of the challenges that I have, doing this work is just kind of coming up with that mindset of like, you've heard one story, you've heard them all, but I'm here to tell you after so many, like thousands of conversations at this point with people who've experienced harm, like, yeah, there's always going to be a thread, right? That weaves through them all. And, but each person is so uniquely beautiful and their journey is their journey. And I think that's why I fell in love with podcasting because it's the most human thing that we can do is share our stories and share that experience and share that hope. Um, and I really hope that people really do start to understand that. I'm seeing a movement more of peer focused conversations in the space from when I started even 5 years ago. And I think I met you at my very first NCPG conference in Boston. We were on a ship together.
yep.
But I don't know that we really
The
connected.
Boston
Yeah.
Tea Party museum.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know that we really connected then, but we have, of course, over the years. And I just want to say, because you've been so kind to me, that you said one of the most profound things that I think I'd heard in a lot of these sessions. I can't remember, it was a couple years ago, one of your sessions at NCPG. And you talked a lot about how, and I told you this just recently, but we're going to put it on the podcast as well because I thought it was so, so important. Is that you talked about how important it was as a clinician, therapist, to not let your clients feel your disappointment in their own recovery. And I thought that that was so impactful because oftentimes we're so hard on ourselves that how much we've done to ourselves, to our family, that the last place we need to feel any type of disappointment or shame is in our clinician's office. And I had an experience where I felt like I let down my therapist. And, I remember that sat with me. I ended up not going to see her again after that because I was just like, if I can't make her happy, like, I'm not doing things right. And that's not fair. And that shouldn't have been put on me. And so I think that's why I connected with that so much.
Well, thanks for that. I know you told me that when I saw you before, but it's always appreciated. I don't deal the best with like praise and stuff, but it means a lot because those are things that I try to. If you know me, I strive for improvement in making changes within the systems we work with and the profession versus trying to look at. I think of it as like instead of trying to change the frog, I'm trying to fix the pond.
Yeah.
It, and
Yeah.
and me, I'm not trying to look at what everyone else needs to do. The to me, the person showing up that's they did a lot right there. When they show up to a room, a session, they call a number. To me, like that's a lot right there. We sometimes look at that as like, well, yeah, that's what they should do, but it's not hard, and it is not without difficulty. So I am always putting a pressure with also balance because I know a lot of us that do this work, it's not easy work, but to me, if we can create that better system for them, for anyone that comes in for seeking care, seeking help, we have these types of conversations where they are the expert. We listen for their story, not assume that we know everything about them. But this is what really then creates this relationship and this opportunity to, you know, heal and recover and fix what has been broken. Because without those things, it's really a lot more challenging, and people don't come back, or they don't try another place. You know, they have a bad experience, and that might be the last time they even try therapy because of how bad it was. So,
And that's so common in the
yeah,
space when because that's the first thing I always recommend. Well, let me get you some um some names of therapists, or let's look at your state and see what they offer, those types of things. And the oftentimes the response is no, I had a really bad experience this one time. And I said, well, I know a ton of great clinicians in the space. They care about you. Like, what do we say? Let's give it a try again. And and that's usually when I try and find somebody that I've maybe connected with, or I go through my own connections to find somebody just because I want them to have that good experience. And it can be such a life-changing experience when you have somebody, but again, it's about that connection building, right?
yeah.
Not that information presenting first, but that connection building and that trust building. And um yeah, I'm truly honored to be working in the space with such amazing people who are just care so much about the people in this space. And that's what I always look for in those connections and things like that. And I'm glad to call you one of those people.
There are so many things we could talk about. This could be like 4 hours long.
I know, I
I'm at
know.
to have you back on another, but this is when we go so long without having, because we didn't even talk about like financial stuff that we've talked about before. I think peer support's another area that we could talk about, because that's really, really important. So I have one last question before we wrap up, and I want to circle back to women in gambling because you really opened my insight to something. Like, if I were to ask you a simple question like, "Hey, what can we do better when it comes to women in gambling?" In my mind, the simple answer that people are going to have is like, "Oh, well, when they come to this or show up, like ask them about gambling and stuff." But I'm like, that misses the part of the problem, is that women are consistently underrepresented in gambling, even substance use and everything. And it's not that they're showing up and we're not asking, but we are not making it easy for someone to show up or to know that is help out there, which means like we can't just wait for people to show up. I think that's what I'm trying to say is with women in gambling, we can't just wait for, well, when they show up, we'll make sure to ask those questions, or I'll make sure I screen every woman I do counseling with about gambling. That's not helping to address some of that. So to me, it's there's going to be an intentional, purposeful need to reach out and try to let women know about seeking help and addressing some of the systematic, social, structural barriers. So my question for you is, how can we even start to do that? Because I don't want to get to the point where it's just, well, let's let them know we're available, and when they show up, then we'll treat them. I think we need to do better than that. And this is a population we need to actually reach out to, engage with, and meet them where they are, not trying to get them to say, hey, once you take care of all those things that you have to, once you deal with all those things, then come over here, because that's exactly why they can't show up or why they struggle to show up. So any feedback
Yeah.
as like my last question on how can we do better with that? Because if we don't, it feels like it's just going to be the same cycle we've been dealing with in these areas of dismissing women and the need that they have for this type of service.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that starts with kind of the messaging, right? The general messaging. Again, going back to how the media hyper focuses on one story. It might even look like working with your local media to have conversations about women in gambling, and then hopefully it can expand into bigger conversations. I think definitely the messaging. one of the things I think is the biggest miss in the prevention messaging is the prevention messaging oftentimes doesn't fit the prevention message or who they're talking to, if that makes sense. So like oftentimes, like when we're looking at women, prevention is usually a general conversation with usually images of young men, right? So women aren't seeing themselves even in the imagery or the conversation, or like college age students aren't seeing themselves in the conversation or the imagery. Like, when you have messaging about, let's just say there's an advert for problem gambling, it might be a man sharing his story, but then that image and that conversation is expected to reach women or young men or college age students when all they're seeing is their dad talking about a story and not seeing another person their age, their demographic, whatever, talking about their own experience. And a lot of that is due to the shame and stigma. So I don't necessarily have a really good answer for this, but I know taking down any types of friction to help, right? So we're looking at women. We want to not target women, but we want women to know that we have telehealth available. That
Mhm.
way it makes it easier for their health, their childcare needs. Or maybe they only have their lunch hour to do it, right? So making sure that you have hours that would work for a single mom. Um, and maybe that even looks like evening time options where they can have a conversation while their kids are doing soccer practice, right? So it becomes this kind of bigger conversation of what is it women need? And oftentimes that might look like extended hours. It might look like telehealth. It might look like childcare options in your office. So, but more than anything, I think the first thing is imagery, right? Like show them somebody that looks like them. Talk about mom guilt in some of the messaging. Things that women are going to be able to connect with in that moment, because that is, I can't tell you how huge that is. To see yourself in the messaging, to hear yourself in the story. And everyone's like, well, if you just give it a chance, you can, you know, hear yourself in anybody's story. And I'm like, yeah, there's going to be a little truth to that. But a woman telling her story resonated more so with me than a man telling his story, right? Like even the level of detail is usually different. So the emotional tones are usually different. Like those things that you never really think about that connect women, women connect differently than men. We know that, right? What's that book? Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Like we have lots of examples of how women and men are different. And to think that all the messaging should just be general and to everybody, like that's where we really need to start, I think.
Yeah, because most other marketers or advertisements know that doesn't work. Like they know how to advertise to different
Yeah,
demographics and
exactly.
men, women. So like to think that we wouldn't have to make sure the messaging connects is very on point. And I think that's such a great takeaway is when we are having the conversations, when we are messaging certain things, are we making sure that we are including, different populations that we are trying to specifically connect with. And we can't hope that one message connects with everyone or that one thing
Yeah,
is going to sit with everyone. And that's why, we should look at multiple ways of messaging things and different ways of having those conversations. So I think that's super important. I'm really appreciative of that insight. So yeah, we're definitely gonna have to have you on again because we didn't even cover everything that we could have. But this was fantastic. I know you and I talk whenever we get together, and there's a lot of things that audience members haven't been able to be a part of, but it is great to be able to have you on and to share your story and some of the things with listeners. So as we wrap up, this is your chance for anything that you got going on, anything you want people to know about, any kind of final message. Here is your chance to share that with the listeners.
well, thanks. Well, we're in our sixth season of the podcast. Don't ask me how we got to six seasons when we're just coming up on 5 years. But if you look at the years, that's how it's done. So, yep, we are coming up. We've got I've been releasing them pretty regularly. Sometimes I take a little hiatus, mental health and all that. Um, but yeah, so that's going really great. Thousands. I think we just capped at over 350,000 downloads since I started the podcast, which, isn't new heights numbers, but sound pretty good for a niche podcast in this space. Um, Doing that, and I'm finishing up my book. I got a signed deal, so I'm finishing up my book. So look for that. And it's
Well,
going to
that's
be,
definitely to have you back on the show to talk about the book.
it'll probably be next year when it's out, but I'm really
Yeah.
excited about that. And it's not just my story. It's clips from stories from the podcast. So I really want to represent women as a whole in the book. And it's not going to be one of these things that's like how to stop gambling. It's just like permission to break free from the shame kind of thing. And so excited about that. Lots of conference travel and things like that. I'll be in Canada mid-month for the big RG Discovery conference they have going. Then I'll be in Washington at the end of the month for their big conference, and then some stuff in between. Hopefully a vacation. But yeah, so you can find the podcast and everything at thebrokeGirlSociety.com. We have a Facebook group that currently has over 3,500 women in it from most of the United States, but from all over the world.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and again, it's like sometimes when I say those numbers, I'm like, oh, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it's just enough, like there's support. We have 4 meetings a week, 4 or 5 meetings a week. I'll have to count. And they're women only. They're topic based. You have to be part of the group to be in the meeting, but we have those available. Myself, I host 2 of them. And a couple other ladies host the rest. We have a SMART meeting on Wednesday nights. We're into SMART recovery. So lots going on. But yeah, people can reach out to me at Christina at thebrokeGirlSociety.com.
We'll have all the links for people to find you, see what you're doing, what you've got going on. But I do want to thank you. It's great seeing you and talking to you. I know I was so fortunate to see you back-to-back months in person, which it's not a common thing. So for listeners, that is not, sometimes for some of us in this space, we are probably on airplanes at the same time, going to some different conference or speaking engagement, and all of a sudden you realize that it lines up with everybody else. So it was really great to be able to spend that time together in person, but also for being a guest on this podcast, because it has been a long time coming. It was more of me not having you on sooner than I should have. Now I need to have you on multiple times, because it's amazing to think of that you were one of the first names in this space to learn about outside of my state, my little bubble, and the work that you've done just in general, but also for women is profound. I don't think there's any other name that I connect with as much with women in gambling as you. And that's who I refer to people when I say, you want to learn about this, talk about this, find more out about it. I'm not the one for that you are. And the Broke Girl Society is such a great space for that. So thanks for being on the show, and can't wait to see you again. And we will talk more, and we will have you back on the podcast.
All right. Well, thanks.
You've been listening to Talking Addiction and Recovery with Andrew J. Schreier. We're so glad you've joined us and invite you to connect further with the show and these topics at www.andrewjschreier.com. That's Andrew J. SCHREIER.com. You can also email us directly at talkingaddictionandrecovery@gmail.com and connect on social media, Instagram at Talking Addiction and Recovery, Facebook Talking Addiction and Recovery Podcast, and Twitter at TalkAR_podcast. To stay connected and never miss an episode, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe. Until next time, friends, let's keep talking addiction and recovery.